Good morning. This is Jose Toron, IRENA's Regional Program Officer for Latin America and the Caribbean. It is an honor to welcome you to this virtual event, Advancing the Energy Transition in Latin America through Nationally Determined Contribution, NDCs. I will be the Master of Ceremonies during today's session. It is my pleasure to join you today. I would like to remind you that we have English-Spanish interpretation throughout the event, selecting it at the bottom right of your screen. Les recuerdo que tenemos interpretación inglés-español durante todo el evento, seleccionándola en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. I take the opportunity to also welcome all participants that are online today. We have representatives from 59 countries and a total of 298 registered participants in the event. Right now, I would like to mention some general announcements for today's virtual session. Please make sure to mute yourself during the session to avoid background noise. If you encounter any technical issue, please write your issue in the chat box. And if you have questions to the speaker, please use the Q&A option. The slides will be shared via email after the end of the webinar, and a recording of the webinar will also be available. At the end of the event, please tell us how we did in the survey to help us improve. Now I will briefly mention the agenda set for day 2 of this event. We will begin opening remarks from IRENA and UNFCCC, followed by presentations by UNFCCC on their regional work towards NDC's implementation. At the end of the presentations, we will continue the first panel discussion of the day, moderated by Hugh Seeley from the University of West Indies. That will feature representatives of the governments of Antigua and Barbuda and Uruguay, as well as the Caribbean community CARICOM and IRENA, addressing the subjects of long-term energy scenarios development on the role of end-use sectors toward decarbonization. Following, we will have a second panel discussion moderated by Maria Tapia from the Inter-American Development Bank that will include representatives from the World Bank, the Private Financing Advisory Network, PFAN, the Green Climate Fund, and IRENA, in which the topic of financing NDC's implementation in Latin America and the Caribbean will be covered. Without further ado, I would like to invite Gurbuz Gonul, Director of Country Engagement and Partnerships of IRENA, and Ventura Silva, Regional Lead of UNFCCC's Regional Collaboration Center in St. George, to turn on their cameras to kick off the first part of the event with their opening remarks. Now I continue with Director Gurbuz Gonul for his opening remarks. Over to you, Gurbuz.
Thank you very much, Jose. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And greetings from Abu Dhabi. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the second day of the virtual event on advancing the energy transition in Latin America and the Caribbean through nationally determined contributions. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is looking to move on from this very challenging period due to the ongoing pandemic, and countries are working on the monumental task of developing economic recovery and stimulus packages, including in Latin America and Caribbean. In this context, we believe that the goals set out in the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and the Paris Climate Agreement can serve as a compass to stay on course during this period of uncertainty. They can help to ensure that the short-term solutions adopted in the face of the pandemic are in line with medium and long-term development and climate goals. This particular year represents a significant milestone in global efforts to take additional action towards further cutting energy-related carbon dioxide emissions through the update of the NDCs, Nationally Determined Contributions. Through the review of NDCs during the past months, countries have committed to having more ambitious goals, which in turn raises the pledge of implementing agencies to provide firm and determined support for the implementation of these contributions. As mentioned by the IRENA Director General yesterday, IRENA is currently working with more than 60 countries across the globe, including 18 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, And what we are trying to do is to strengthen the energy component of the NDCs by providing assistance in reviewing targets, elaborating decarbonization plans, building technology roadmaps, etc. Working with the ministries in charge of energy and environment, we target our support to help countries set the course for achieving a long-term pathway for a low carbon future. The agency also supports countries in the implementation phase of the NDCs, in the development of NDC implementation plans and investment frameworks, but on top of that, also providing project level support through our ongoing collaboration with UNDP, SC4All, and Green Climate Fund under the Climate Investment Platform initiative. This initiative aims at accelerating investments in renewable energy with a view to contributing to the realization of the ambitious NDCs. In this effort, IRENA is teaming up with governments, financial institutions, project developers, and the private sector in developing solid project pipelines backed by the governments, assisting in bringing project proposals to bankability and facilitating their access to finance. From early next year, depending on how the situation is going to be on the ground with the ongoing pandemic, we will start implementation of the platform with events organized on the ground, because we intend to support the implementation of the platform through the organization of investment forums in 14 geographic clusters, including one in Central America and Caribbean, and another for South America. So we are hoping that these investment platforms will offer an effective fora for enhanced government investor dialogue towards creating more conducive conditions for investments, dedicated project matchmaking between projects identified and brought to potential bankability on the one side, and the project investors and financiers interested to work with this project. And as the third component, we are also planning to organize related capacity building activities during those platform events. So we are very much looking forward to organizing these events in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, today's session will focus on the NDC implementation phase. So we'll be hearing from speakers and panelists on the importance of aligning the short-term efforts reflected in the NDCs with long-term strategies through development of long-term energy scenarios, targeting the decarbonization of end-use sectors such as power, transport, building, heating, cooling, etc. The second part of the event will feature several multilateral agencies and development banks discussing the investment and finance landscape in Latin America and Caribbean for the implementation of energy NDCs in light of the challenges posed by the pandemic. Being in the center of the global energy transformation, we hope that renewable energy will remain a strong priority for the region in the post-pandemic period. And I just want to express our readiness to deepen collaboration with the region to support the revision and implementation of NDCs and keep the region an appealing destination for renewable energy developers and investors. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to very fruitful discussions today.
Thank you, Gürbüz. Let me continue from there. It gives us great pleasure for us to partner with IRENA and the other national governments, as well as the regional and international development organizations in bringing you this event. We thought it was very timely that we initiate this. As you know, most of the governments, as Gürbüz mentioned, has initiated updating and revising their NDCs. And we have several of the countries who are now in the phase of focusing from the presentation of the NDC documentation to the UNFCCC in the phase of implementation. What we noted from most of the INDCs that were submitted in 2015 that led up to and actually formed the basis or the foundation of the Paris Agreement was that since 2015, we had not made much progress in terms of the implementation, the tracking of implementation. And when we came to the stage of revising or updating the NDCs, we realized that most of the countries were struggling to identify where they were in terms of the progress that was made, and also what needs to be done in order to prepare for the implementation. Now, most of the targets, as you know from the revision, would indicate all the countries will have a target for 2030 indicated, where some of the countries will also have a 2025 target indicated in their nationally determined contributions. Now, that prompts us to know how ready are these countries in terms of implementation. And when we look at the NDCs, most of the countries in the Caribbean and majority in Latin America has prioritized the energy sector, including transport, energy efficiency, and renewables, as the key means of achieving their mitigation goals in their NDCs. And this is why I thought it was important that we try to look at some of the best practices across the region, where different countries have taken initiatives, and look at how we could actually learn from each other and also provide a guidance on how actually to go about the implementation of the commitments they are making under the NDC, how to track their NDCs, the progress, to understand where they are, what are the changes in the baseline, and also to understand like how to implement this systematically, integrating with the national development priorities, the sustainable development goals, the resilience targets, as well as the post-COVID recovery progress. So this is why we wanted to focus the second day of this session on more focusing towards the implementation. One, looking at the long-term energy planning, the long-term sustainable development planning, as well as the integration with the low emission development strategies that would be a longer term, and then looking at how these NDCs would be the building blocks that would be focusing on specific time period that would build up to those achievement of those long-term targets, that would in turn also be focusing towards meeting the long-term targets of the Paris Agreement, which is a key political motivation for the SIDS in the Caribbean, especially achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that is committed under the Paris Agreement as long-term goals of the agreement. And we needed to look at various elements in terms of achieving this, the institutional arrangement that are needed, the legal framework that would facilitate engagement of the private sector, the other facilities to encourage more investment from the private sector, because as you know, most of the countries are now, the national governments are committed towards the post-COVID recovery. And that would mean that they would need more engagement from the private sector in order to ensure that the targets under climate change mitigation, the energy sector targets are achieved, and also looking towards international support, innovative climate finance support. And that's why we thought that this topic of climate finance is also a key in this discussion. But there are other topics such as the social and economic impact of this NDC implementation, and reference to topics such as just transition, how to manage the stranded assets, then also to look at better MRV or monitoring, reporting, verification systems in order to quantify the improvement that are achieved. as well. For the Caribbean, we, together with the other partners who are involved, including IRENA and the regional agencies such as CARICOM, the Organization of East Caribbean, and also the international development partners, the regional and international development banks, we are discussing towards bringing in a policy brief for the decision makers in order to identify what are the best practices available, what would be the next steps towards the implementation of their NDCs, so that they could be better prepared in terms of implementing the energy sector actions towards meeting their objectives and achieving the 2030 targets. We hope you will have interesting discussions in these two sessions, and that we will also encourage participation, your questions to develop further these topics, so that these all would feed into the work that we would do together with the partners in the region, both for Latin America through our Panama office and Caribbean through the office in Grenada, on helping the implementation phase of these NTCs, so that you would, leading up to 2030, have better preparation and addressing all the socioeconomic concerns, as well as be able to effectively communicate, develop financial strategies for the implementation, as well as the other legal institutional frameworks that will be needed, and deliver those NDCs successfully, as well as link them with the national development, the energy security in the region as well. Wishing you all the best and an interesting discussion in the following sessions. Back to you, Jose.
Thank you, Gurbu, for these words, and thank you, Ventura Silva, Regional Lead of UNFCCC Collaboration Center in St. George's, for these opening remarks. We now turn to Daniel Galvan Perez from UNFCCC Collaboration Center in Panama, who will deliver a presentation of their work towards the implementation of NDCs. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just want to confirm that you can hear me well. Let me turn off the camera. Yes.
We hear you very well, Daniel.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Good morning, good afternoon. Greetings from Panama. My name is Daniel Galvan, and I am the Technical Officer of RCC Panama. And for me, it is a pleasure to present on behalf of our RCC. And first, I want to thank IRENA and RCC St. George for organizing this very interesting webinar. Next slide, please. My presentation will be focused on the NDC survey that we did in Latin America, and also about the support that we provide to facilitate the NDC implementation in the region. I will take just 1 minute to talk about the RCC Panama, and finally I have 2 slides to talk about the just transition concept. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yesterday, during the NDC discussions session, we had the opportunity to hear from Chile and Jamaica about how they are revising and how they revise and improve and increase the ambition of their NDCs. And I think it's important to highlight how the preparation of the NDCs has evolved during the past years. Sorry. As you know, at the beginning, we had the INDCs that were submitted before the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015. And during 2016, yes, many countries converted these INDCs into NDCs as a part of the ratification of the Paris Agreement. And starting from 2017, we had these NDC dialogues. The first edition was in Ecuador, in Quito, and during that dialogue, we saw how the countries start implementing, for example, new institutional arrangement, and we start seeing the participation not only from the Ministry of Environment, but also from other ministries like energy, finance, planning, health, education, and the countries start developing procedures to have a more standard way on how to develop and or revise and institutionalize the NDCs in the country. In 2018, the ICTU guidelines to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding in NDC were adopted during COP24 as a part of the Katowice rulebooks to implement the Paris Agreement. And in 2019, we start receiving the new NDCs, and many other countries start or were working in revising and updating their NDCs. During this year, despite of the COVID situation, the countries continue working in their NDCs and implemented innovative solutions, like, for example, the virtual national consultations. This is an action that was initially a challenge, but became an opportunity because now more citizens, entities, and are getting involved in the revision on NDCs. And of course, there is always this option of record all these dialogues and all these sessions. So it's a legacy that countries are creating for the future development of NDCs. Also during this year, a part of the support that we are doing here in the RCCs, we had two workshops to provide capacity building to the countries about the ICTU guidelines. We had the opportunity to do an hands-on training exercise where we basically go through the NDCs that were already submitted, and we realized that many of these countries were already considering these guidelines. So with this, we can expect that the new NDCs that will be submitted during the next month will be more robust, more standardized, and it will be easier to do comparison among the countries. And of course, we are expecting that they will be more ambitious. What is next? Well, basically during the next year, our colleagues in our Bonn office will start working in the synthesis report. We are expecting that during December and January this year, we will be receiving many of these first or revised NDCs, and the synthesis report should be ready before COP in COP 2026. And of course, this will be a continuous process. In the 2023, we will have the stock take, and in the 2025, we are expecting to receive NDCs, and it will be a continuous process until the next years. So this with this slide, what I want to basically say is to highlight all this effort that the countries are doing, and also the support that we are providing from the RCCs. Next slide, please. Thank you. Very quickly to talk about the RCC Panama. This RCC operates thanks to the collaboration with UN Environment, and we are expanding our activities, and we are expanding our collaboration with other entities such as LAC, and we are expecting also start working with IDB. And of course, we collaborate with many other institutions in the region, like IRENA, but also other UN agencies like UNICEF, UNDP, FAO, and we try to facilitate the communication among all the different implementing institutions, including the NDC partnership. The RCC Panama basically provides technical support to 70 countries in Latin America, from Mexico to Chile. We basically provide capacity building, we disseminate information about climate change, and we facilitate the communication between the region and our bond office and among the different countries. So that's just an overview of our RCC for you to know about it. Thank you. Okay, now talking about the NDC survey. The NDC survey was carried out between April and May this year. As you know, it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and we wanted to have an overview of what is going to happen in the region in the next months in terms of on the revision of the NDCs. We contacted 19 countries in Latin America, including Dominican Republic and Cuba, because they are Spanish-speaking countries. And we received response from 15 countries, which are the ones that are listed here in this slide. Next one, please. As I said, the objective of this survey was to have an overview on how the countries were progressing on the revision of their NDCs. It consists on 70 questions that were strategically developed with the aim to identify political and technical challenges faced by the Latin American countries. It was prepared by in collaboration with UN Environment and the NDC Partnership. And in the next slide, I'm going to present some consolidated information, but you can find the entire report. We provide the link in the last slide of this presentation. The next one, please. Okay, the first question that we asked the countries were, we wanted to know whether they will be submitted a new NDC in 2020. And we found that 13 countries respond with a positive response, and only 2 say no. I would like to highlight something that these 2 countries that say no are basically those countries that submitted already their NDC, which is Uruguay and Ecuador. They submitted the NDC during 2019. So it's not written here, but the expected date was that for submission is between November and this year and January next year. Next slide, please. Another important question that is relevant to this webinar is we asked the countries how they were thinking on increasing the ambition of the NDC, and we can see here that from the 15 responses, 12 countries mentioned that they are aligning the NDCs with the SDG and with the mid and long-term climate change strategies. At the same time, 8 countries mentioned that they are including new mitigation targets, and 10 countries mentioned that they were implementing legal frameworks, policies, or laws to enable NDC enhancement. I think what is important to mention here is that in this, for example, in this response about the new mitigation targets, during the different discussions that we are attending for the NDC revision of different countries, they are expecting, of course, to increase the targets in the mitigation components, and this is something as we have discussed yesterday. This is related to the long-term strategies where the most of the countries are thinking on for example, Costa Rica, that they are proposing the decarbonization plans, and also Chile start working a long-term strategy. Guatemala have a set of mitigation actions. Most of them focus on the energy sector. So we can expect that these new NDCs will have or will facilitate the transition of, to a low carbon economy. So yeah, next slide, please. Another question, this one was a more open question where we try to consolidate all the responses. We asked them how the countries are intending to enhance their NDCs, and they basically provide many different comments and concepts and words, and we create this word cloud where you can see that energy sector is one of the sectors that the countries are thinking on to provide more information, and they want to increase their targets related to reduction of GHG emissions. We see also energy efficiency, electromobility, and yeah, and also the SDG indicators, which are also linked to the transformation to a low carbon economy. So I think in our opinion that these new NDCs will facilitate this energy transition in Latin America. Next slide, please. I include this question because we directly asked the countries about whether they were considering to include a new policy in their updated NDCs. And as you can see, 7 countries mentioned that they will include policies on renewable energy targets. And also 4 countries mentioned about carbon pricing instruments. And as you know, these carbon pricing instruments basically aims to facilitate the low carbon transformation. So as I said, we are expecting that that these new NDCs will provide more a good signal of what is the objective and ambition of these countries in regards to renewable energy implementation in the next years. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in one of the questions, 12 out of 15 countries mentioned that they will align the NDCs with the SDG. And of course, this will have an impact on SDGs, like for example, number 7 and SDG 13, 12, and 17. These are the most, these SDGs are linked and are part of the action needed for the transformation, the low carbon economy transformation. And as a conclusion, in the NDCs related to energy transformation, as I said, what we can expect is that we will have a better signal from the countries in regards to how they are going to implement this GHG mitigation target, but we will have also a more robust NDCs, because now these NDCs are aligned to the national strategies, are aligned also to the long-term strategies, and also we are expecting that these NDCs will be more standardized, and it will be more easier to compare among them. And of course, we are expecting that the targets in the NDCs will be more ambitious. Very quickly about the just transition concept. As you know, the low carbon energy transition are already happening in many countries. Sometimes it's due to the economic factors and sometimes it's due to health concerns, but also it is supported and accelerated by the climate change policies. Nevertheless, the actors involved, including government, business, workers, communities, have a tendency to protect the status quo and keep the carbon-intensive industries alive. So the just transition approach basically ensures that those that can be affected are considered by those that are making the decisions. As you can see in the slide, according to the International Labour Organization, achieving the 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement could bring a net employment gain of 18 million jobs. And there are some statistics there of how this just transition is being considered and how it can be a good opportunity to create more jobs. And I think that's something that had been discussed a lot during this during the opening speech gave by Ventura and yesterday during the discussions. In the early action on just transition, of course, can minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive opportunities. The Paris Agreement includes the just transition as an important principle, but I think it's important to mention that there is no a specific set of rules on how to implement the just transition. It is more a vision and a process that is based on dialogues that should involve all the affected or all the stakeholders that can be affected like workers, industries, governments, and it has to be negotiated and implemented based on the specific context of the countries. It's based on geographical, political, cultural, and social context. However, it is possible also to refer to the guidelines that are provided by the International Labour Organization to have an idea on how this can be implemented. We can provide more information if you need it. And my last slide, please. Finally, I would like to sorry, I forgot to yeah, the last one, please. And finally, I would like to invite you to visit our website. You can find all our latest articles and publication. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to present during this important webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for this insightful presentation. We now turn again to Ventura Silva for a presentation on the work being carried out on UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center in St. George's. Ventura, over to you.
Thank you, Jose. Can we move to the next slide, please? So as Daniel mentioned, the RCC St. George's, similar to Panama, is supporting 16 Caribbean countries which are listed here. So it's the CARIFORUM countries, that's CARICOM plus Dominican Republic and Cuba, which are supported from the RCC St. George's. We, as part of support together with our partners, had been engaged in a series of virtual exchanges that were to provide technical support and technical guidance and a platform for sharing experience amongst the various members of the Caribbean SIDS, as well as also there was an exchange between the Pacific SIDS and the Caribbean SIDS on the NDCs and the use of ICTU guidelines that was facilitated by EOSIS, which was one of the partners for that exchange. We directly been supporting most of the Caribbean countries on the technical work in the revision and update of their NDCs, mostly in identifying the baselines and the projection of the NDC scenarios. As part of that work, we conducted a survey similar to what Daniel presented for Panama, for St. George's countries, the Caribbean. So we had at this stage 15 responses, so only Barbados is missing on these responses. Looking at some of the indicators. So we look at actually what was the progress since the INDCs or the NDCs were developed in 2015. And you will see that most of the progress had been on the energy sector in development of renewable energy projects. So those have progress, and these were like mostly the projects that were on the pipeline. There were new policies and strategies introduced in transport sector. We've seen a lot of new developments also on the energy sector reforms on the policies, as well as on the enhancement of renewable energy in the building sector. And you'll see some grid improvements as well. The next slide, please. And when it came to the transportation sector, you would see there were a lot of these three sectors, which we see in countries having the most number of work being done. As I said, the vehicle emission policies had been a top priority, where most of the respondents had indicated that they had done some work on. And there also was a work on the transportation data collection, because that was one of the biggest challenges we faced in 2015, in a lack of information on the transportation sector to identify what baseline are we going to improve from. And this was something that still remains a challenge as we experienced in the NDC revision process. But there were some progress since 2015. There were some data that were available for use in the NDC revision process. Next slide, please. This is another sector that was indicated, the FLU sector. I will not go into details here, but you could see there were some work that was done since 2015 also in the forestry sector. So this is forestry and other land use changes. Next slide. And now going to the Ndc update process, so you would see that when the work had started on the Ndc revision, you would see Belize was one of the earliest to start working on this revision in August 2019. There were some others, majority of them with the NDC partnership, who started working in 2019. The initial idea of most of these initiatives was to actually complete the NDCs in 2020. We now know that although we will have several of the NDCs that would be submitted before end of the year, we have Cuba, Grenada, Jamaica, and Suriname who have submitted their revised or updated NDC. The others, there might be a few more that would submit before the end of the year during this month. But we see that some of the work might go on to next year in the revision process as well. These were to do with also sometimes to do with the coordination of support they were requesting, sometimes to do with also the national circumstances, as there were several changes in the governments, also in the process, in the national systems as well. Next slide, please. So what were the reasons for the NDCs, what they wanted to include in this revision process? So you will see there were majority of the NDCs that the countries that responded indicate that there were going to be indication of new sectors in the NDC. The previous NDCs, mainly in most of the countries, I guess, except Guyana, predominantly focused on the energy sector. As Guyana, it was more focusing on the forestry sector, but the revision would have more focus on the energy sector as well. There were new information available. A lot of things has changed during these 5 years. The information that was used for the 2015 update were maybe from 2013, 2012, or 2014. And now we have more updated information. Most of the countries had done their national communications or biennial update reports, which provided new information. And also the progress on the feasibility studies that were done on some of the projects some of the projects that was in the pipeline that was envisaged to be completed within the time frame of 2025 or 2030 sometimes became not feasible. Sometimes those time frame were dragged on further because of the further studies indicated that more research, more testing had to be done before certain technologies were introduced. Sometimes some technologies, of course, the prices of some of the renewable energy technologies became cheaper, so there were like more penetration that was expected faster than that was predicted in 2015. So we are now going through these changes that are going to be incorporated in this revised version that you would see. There were changes in the policies and also about access to finance. And some, of course, indicated more ambitious targets with the data and the knowledge of the projects that are coming into the pipeline. Next slide, please. But there were some indicators that actually limited the commitment for more ambitious targets that was expected at the beginning of the NDC revision process. But as you know, with COVID, access to data became limited. Most of the countries, the supporting agencies could not visit the countries for actually in-country consultation. So most of the consultation had to be taken virtually. And this became a challenge. As you know, COVID also put pressure on the national economies on access to finance, will become more complicated than that was envisaged in 2015. And this had become the biggest barrier for increasing ambition. Insufficient data that was also enhanced through the COVID scenario. The government capacity to implement the national the government officers have limited capacity to engage with the partners to implement these priorities, and these became a barrier, including some of the countries, as you see, has indicated insufficient time for the revision process or to give a more ambitious target. Next slide, please. I mentioned COVID-19. You would see the impact that was on the NDC revision process. So the stakeholder consultations were limited, were restricted to virtual interactions, which are not considered more effective. Some of the capacity building work that was needed could not be conducted effectively, and this created delays in this process. The submission process was also pushed back. There was also delays that was in the technical support that was needed, and also in-country coordination that actually delayed the process of the NDC revisions. And this resulted in the delivery dates delays that we've seen in the previous slide. Next slide, please. When it came to mitigation needs, what are the support that are needed from these countries as they communicated in the survey? So they needed, you would see, this is not ranked in a particular order, but based on the questions asked, you would see the need for the support for the MRV, monitoring and evaluation, the projection and modeling that are linked with that. Then you will see a big requirement in the technical and financial support for this includes accessing finance, accessing technology, then technical support on the energy efficiency side, policy development, as well as the other linked capacity building requirements that includes access to finance, access to technology, better management of the policies, as well as the implementation of the policies. Next slide. Looking at the how this, so we asked a question on how the support from the international partners could be made effective, because the UN agencies in general, through what we have now a system, what we call the issue-based coalitions, where all the UN agencies working in a region, in this case Latin America and Caribbean, are coordinated in supporting on several issues. And one of the issues that one has a dedicated issue-based coalition is for climate change and disaster risk reduction. And all the UN agencies are looking at how we can enhance support for the countries, how we can be better prepared. And these were the countries' requests on how we could actually improve our support work. The one, of course, was a larger budget that was needed because we had restrictions. We had to run pilots with only a limited number of countries. We could not support all the countries in the region through some of these initiatives. More flexibility in spending. Sometimes on the process, we understand there are needs for flexibility. We were not, for example, accounting for COVID scenario and the challenges in the beginning of some of these initiatives, and we had to be more flexible and adapting to these changes. Earlier availability, so going towards the next revision cycle and the implementation, it's important that the support is available earlier on and the countries are engaged and the discussion take place early. And this is one reason why I said that this discussion and the sessions like these, now focusing on the implementation phase, is important. So the governments are engaged and we identify the challenges and we start addressing these challenges together with the government's priorities, the regional institutions' priorities, and whatever the work that's going on, and better collaboration amongst the partners. And then also a longer time frame in this engagement. So not beyond a simple 1 year, 2 year time frame where we are just trying to revise the NDC, but to look at how those can be carried on forward to integrate with the long-term low emission development strategies, how to integrate that with the implementation of the NDCs. Next slide, please. This is about some other challenges for further improve or increasing the NDC ambition in the future revisions. And also what are the challenges they face at national level. So you can look at some of these, which are about like identifying financial resources, which I mentioned was one of the key challenges, but understanding also the wider economic impacts, identifying most appropriate policy options, and also securing the political support from the wider, the other it's more about the interministerial coordination and ensuring there's a general buy-in from the public as well as the ministries. And also about cost of implementation, as well as said, those countries now facing challenges post-COVID with economies hit hard in the Caribbean, which were dependent on tourism because of the COVID. How are these going to be a green recovery that was mentioned, and how this considerations on mitigation, the national determined contribution, the SDGs are all built into this green recovery challenge. Next slide, please. And then we look at some of the challenges that are to do with accessing international funds, which we hope will be discussed in the last session of today's seminar as well in detail. The challenges about knowledge, about the funding sources itself, and the lack of capacity to prepare proposals had been a key challenge in the Caribbean region. There were several initiatives. Also, the GCF has their readiness capacity building for readiness initiative that are trying to address these challenges as well. We have various institutions focusing on sectors like we had the one from the Global Water Partnership focusing on the water sector. The WHO PAHO had a session on the healthcare sector. There were energy sector discussions with SICRI. They are focusing on also further support for this initiative. But this had been also always a key challenge for preparing better projects that would get approval in accessing these fundings. Lower application success rate was a direct result of this. Country eligibility had been an issue with some of the countries. We have countries like Bahamas, St. Kitts and Nevis who need support, but because of some ODA eligibility restrictions, they will not be able to access some of these funding that's available, including for support, including for capacity building. And these had been some of the challenges that the countries in the Caribbean are facing that has restricted better accessibility to international funds for implementation, as well as for technical and support for building capacity in the region. Last slide. This is the tentative NDC submission dates. We already, as you know, had the submissions from Suriname, Jamaica, Cuba. Grenada had already submitted their NDC, and we are also expecting Dominican Republic, Haiti, and St. Lucia, and possibly Belize may submit their NDC within this month. And then we are looking at the other NDCs that are still to be submitted next year. Next slide. I think that was my last slide. Thank you very much, and back to you, Jose. But we'll be happy, as Daniel mentioned, for the Caribbean countries to coordinate and collaborate with the other partners, continue to provide support for the countries, including the regional organizations such as CARICOM, SICRI, and the other IRENA, international partners, IDB, and other partners as well. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ventura. Thank you for this presentation. We will now begin the first panel discussion, addressing best practices and experiences on developing long-term energy scenarios and the deployment of end-use sector solutions toward decarbonization. The panel will be moderated by Mr. Hugh Seeley, lecturer of the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies of the University of the West Indies. Mr. Seeley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose, and I hope that you can hear me well. And thank you to the organizers, the UK in partnership with Italy as the incoming COP president, IRENA, and of course the regional collaboration centers in Panama and Grenada. Thank you for the presentations that were made by Daniel and Ventura. If you would allow me to comment quickly, I was very interested to hear Daniel say that he expects to see further standardization in the NDCs that will be submitted by our Latin American colleagues. I find that interesting, and that 12 of them have already said that they will align their NDCs with their SDGs and their long-term strategies, which is the focus that we want to have now in this session, which should last about 35 minutes. And we're going to look at the best practices and experiences on developing long-term energy scenarios and the links to NDC development, particularly on the challenges of deployment of end-use sector solutions to decarbonize our economies. To put that in plain language, how are we going to link our long-term planning with our short-term 2030 or 2025 goals that we have in our NDCs, and vice versa? Ladies and gentlemen, we have a really excellent panel with us today. And I'd like to quickly introduce the panel members. We have Ms. Ezra Christopher from the government of Antigua and Barbuda. And Antigua and Barbuda will be taking over the chairmanship of the Alliance of Small Island States on January the 1st. So congratulations to Antigua as a fellow member of the Caribbean and from the University of the West Indies as a CARICOM institution. We pledge our support to you in that incoming role. Ms. Christopher is a monitoring and evaluation consultant within the Ministry of Health and Wellness and the Environment in Antigua and Barbuda. She's a coordinator of the Monitoring and Evaluation Sub-Program. So her job is to assess the performance of the department's climate change, biodiversity, pollution, and data management programs. And she's also managing a fairly active portfolio of something like 14 projects funded by the international donor agencies like the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environmental Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and the Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, among others. So welcome, Ms. Christopher. We also have Dr. Sami Miketa. She's a senior program officer with the Innovation and Technology Center at IRENA, She's based in Germany. Since 2012, she's been leading a program to support long-term energy planning activities in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And key components in this program include the development of models of African power pools, provision of training seminars to government officials, and development of regional renewable roadmaps, and modeling variable renewable energy scenarios for policy making. Welcome, Dr. Maketa. We also have with us Ms. Beatrice Olivet. She's an environmental advisor at the Ministry of Industry, Energy and Mining of Uruguay, working mainly on aspects of energy and climate change, and to incorporate environmental aspects in the designing of different initiatives. She teaches eco-efficiency at the Cleaner Production Center of the University of Montevideo. She has a background in chemistry and postgraduate studies on cleaner production and environmental management. Amongst her other responsibilities, she represents her ministry in the National System of Response to Climate Change. Welcome, Ms. Olivet. And then finally, but not least, we have Dr. Devin Gardner, who is the program manager for energy and the head of the energy unit at the Caribbean Community Secretariat, and he's been there since September of 2014. Devin is an old friend, and he has oversight of the energy program, which is tasked with the identification of common policies and strategies for transforming the energy sector within the Caribbean community. So welcome, colleagues. As I said, I think we have about 35 minutes at our disposal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 2 rounds of questions to you. Ezra, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Can you please briefly present what are the long-term low-emission development strategies for Antigua and Barbuda, in particular in your energy sector, especially for the end-use sectors, power, transport, industry, buildings. And please feel free to elaborate in case you want to highlight any types of relevant technology applications like hydrogen, rooftop, solar PV, electric vehicles that may be relevant to your long-term strategy. So welcome, and Ms. Christopher, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I want to start off by just giving you some context. Here in Antigua and Barbuda, we face more frequent and intense tropical storms and hurricanes, and we're also prone to droughts, intense floods, a rise in air temperatures, and decreased annual rainfall, and we also suffer from sea level rise. So these impacts have definitely increased the country's economic vulnerability and put pressure on the use of our resources to respond, as well as to recover from such events. So this has really brought attention for us that we need to plan better and prepare better for risk. So we have already indicated that we're committed to reducing emissions and to combat climate change. So this has made us even more so motivated to transition. But what we face in our energy sector is that we're heavily dependent on fossil fuels. We have no indigenous fossil fuel resources for energy supply. We import 100% of our fossil fuels to serve our needs. And we typically import heavy fuel oil, diesel, liquefied petroleum gas, jet fuel, and gasoline. So given that we're heavily dependent in this area, we recognize that this is just not sustainable for us, and a transition is inevitable, especially since what we're seeing is that our average households in Antigua and Barbuda pay between 7 to 10% of their monthly earnings on electricity. So in 2019, the cabinet charged us with, that is the Department of Environment, to lead these efforts to provide guidance on 100% fossil fuel phase out. So we reached out to IRENA through the SIDS Lighthouse Initiative and also the NDC partnership through its Climate Action Enhancement Package to conduct separate studies to inform what the phase out should look like. And in the electricity sector, what we anticipate is introducing like short and long-term regulatory supporting mechanisms, developing clean energy generation regulations, for instance, alternative power purchase agreements, introducing feed-in tariffs, setting science-based targets for RE generation, introducing strategic financing for renewable energy backup systems, and replacing fossil fuel plants with RE sources as they approach end of life. We're also looking to target the standby generator sector for transition to grid interactive renewable energy systems. And we feel that this is one way of building resiliency over time. Now, in the transport sector, we're also looking to regulate or limit new investment in fossil fuel technologies. For instance, we're looking to phase out ICE vehicles. We're also looking to introduce policies and regulations that curtail the sale of these vehicles while incentivizing the purchase of low carbon and EVs. So we're also looking to introduce sector coupling to promote the uptake of low carbon and EVs with the uptake of RE technologies, as well as encourage local private sector participation in these efforts. So for us, this will form part of what our fossil fuel, the strategy for our fossil fuel phase out would look like. Because the transition to RE for us is not just about mitigating against climate change, but building resilience in the building sector, the electricity and transport sector, in agriculture, as well as in the IT sector. So current energy systems for us are not really resilient to withstand against climate change impacts. And so the phase out plan will enhance the resilience of households and the commercial sector by improving access to energy post-disaster. And we also want to reduce the socioeconomic impacts of our dependence on fossil fuels, and in the long term, contribute to an improvement of living conditions for households.
Thank you, Ezra. Can I ask you a follow-up question very, very quickly? I noticed that you stressed that you expect to get some adaptation co-benefits from going to renewable energy by building some resilience. And I'm going to put you on the spot and ask how, because there's been a big question going through the Caribbean as to whether distributed generation, in other words, having a lot of solar PV panels on our roofs, actually improves our resilience or actually makes us more vulnerable to extreme weather events. And you in Antigua, of course, are constantly, knock wood, being experienced to extreme hurricanes. So how do you intend to go green and increase your resilience at the same time? In your generation model, I heard you talk about standby generators, et cetera, but are you going to bury your utility lines? Are you going to have building codes in place for these renewable energy installations, et cetera? Can you quickly respond on that?
Yeah, sure. You're right in saying that we have definitely been hard hit more recently by hurricanes, and even more recently, we had a flash flood, which created quite a bit of damage on our infrastructure and to households. So some of the approaches that we're considering is building the resilience of our road infrastructure. We have already started efforts to bury utility lines. In terms of creating that enabling environment, we're looking to do that in our building sector. We've already started to look at our building code and to improve the standards and in the building code, as well as promote better building practices among contractors. So we've already started those efforts currently, but looking ahead, we are seeking to possibly do bi-directional charging, do sector coupling in the energy and transportation sectors. We're also considering projects that will do sector coupling in the energy and agriculture sectors, as well as the transportation and backup energy sectors. We're also looking to, Antigua and Barbuda is a country that struggles we're very water scarce. So we're also looking to decentralize reverse osmosis desalination, as well as building food security in the long term by equipping our farmers with solar panels and wind turbines. So other projects that we have in the pipeline include those that focus on time-based electricity rates, as well as microgrids.
Thank you very much for your response, especially since you weren't prepared for that one. So thanks a lot. Let me turn to Ms. Olivet from Uruguay. Let's get or another nation's perspective before I turn then to Irina and then to CARICOM. So Ms. Olivet, the question for you. Uruguay has already achieved almost 100% of its electricity coming from renewables. Can you briefly explain to us what is the country's ambition to further decarbonize the energy sector with special focus on transport, industry, buildings? Ms. Olivet, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning for me, almost. No, it's good afternoon here too. So I want to thank, first of all, Irina and the UNFCCC and the UK presidency towards COP26. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. For co-hosting this event, for the kind invitation to my country, Uruguay, to share our experiences, facts, and thoughts about energy and climate change. Well, as you know, Uruguay has made a commitment to elaborate its long-term climate strategy. And it's based on a low carbon and climate resilient development. And it has an aspiration goal of CO2 neutrality by 2050. Obviously, this implies a very strong commitment of the energy sector. As you mentioned, Uruguay has reached a very high renewable share in the power mix, 98% in 2019. But surely this year, it will not reach that value, given the climate events. We have the Niño Modoki at the beginning of the year, and we are experiencing La Niña now. And those for our country and the region in general, like Argentina and Brazil also, it's an important reduction on rainfalls in the region. And we depend partly in hydropower. Before the energy transformation, this situation would have led us to a very large use of thermal power from fossil fuels. I know that in years like this one, it reached 60% of use of fossil fuels for power generation. We estimate that thanks to the contribution of biomass, wind, and solar power, we will not go, we'll be very, very far away from that. But what I wanted to say is, as we see it, we can't think of planning, adaptation, and mitigation as two different issues. We can say that what we did was we adapted our power capacity through mitigation. Okay, that's very important. I always say it. I'm sorry if you are hearing it again. But well, we have a lot to do in the consumer sectors, as you said, as you asked. We still have 37% of the global energy supply coming from fossil fuels. With such a renewable power mix, the weight of transport now is around 60% of CO2 emissions. If we gather industry, agro, fishing, and mining, we have another 23% of those emissions, and households represent 6% of that. In industry, we have an important use of biomass also. In transportation, thinking of things to do. In transportation, electrification is an obvious, very obvious line of work, counting with green power and technology that we expect will become more affordable in the future. But this is important, I think, when we started working on this from this energy perspective, we understood that the issue was much broader, much complex. So we are working towards a sustainable urban mobility policy, which in addition to electrification has other components as efficiency, like public transportation, fleets. It has active mobility and urban development. Obviously, this needs to be done with multiple actors at different levels of government, as well as private, academia, and civil society. Likewise, we continue to analyze the incorporation of hydrogen in long-distance cargo and passenger transport, like power to hydrogen has application in the decarbonization of transport. To move towards CO2 neutrality in 2050, transport emission must become zero or close to that by 2050. And I think technological advances of the next years will be key too. Power to X is one of the lines of work, and it's being analyzed for the industrial sector to substitute fossil fuels. One example are thermal uses as dryers and boilers. And we are designing business models for the use of renewable electricity surpluses in contracts. This is an example, please, like in 5 years with management of the on-off by the utility. This type of contracts we think have several win-win, but they have also challenges. We are also reviewing useful energy balances in different industrial sectors to make specific proposals to change sources from fossil to electric. Without doubt, energy efficiency is a permanent line of work, promoting improvement in national regulations, equipment labeling, subsidies for replacement of more efficient equipment, training, awards. Right now it's happening, the National Efficiency Award. I'm missing it. Well, technical assistance lines, energy consumption simulators, among others. Storage, which appears in our first NDC as conditional to access to means of implementation, it's very important for our electric system with this high share of renewables with their natural variability. We have carried out different technical and economic analysis on accumulation and pumping facilities. The studies on hydrogen storage are more recent, and batteries based on fiscal incentives have already begun to be installed by private companies. In the residential sector, there are different lines of work: energy efficiency in buildings, labeling eco-labeling, energy labeling is one of the NDC commitments, or the use of renewables in traditional fossil fuel applications, such as cooking, among others. Uruguay is a country in which agriculture and agro-industrial production have an important weight on GDP, and we have worked in biogas production from waste. We continue focusing on circular economy in all sectors of the economy. Finally, a renewable power mix gives us many opportunities, but it also entails challenges, such as optimizing its use to reduce discharges and make the best use of the energy generated. The analysis of the system as a whole is crucial. It is not just generation, not just consumption, or putting X megawatt of storage. Our countries have limited resources, and we have to optimize their use for the best results for our population and to respond to climate change. That's what I wanted to say to your question.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Oliver. That was a very, very comprehensive response. I would love to have some follow-up questions with you, but I hope that we have some time towards the end. But I can't help commenting on the fact that especially in your transport sector, that you've recognized the interlinkages with other sectors as well, and how you have to take an integrated approach when we're looking to decarbonize our economy. So there seems to be quite a lot of best practices and experiences coming out of Uruguay that we can benefit from. So thank you very much, Ms. Oliver, and I'll come back to you. Dr. Gardner, I'm going to turn to you at CARICOM. Can you please briefly explain CARICOM's efforts on elaborating energy roadmaps in the Caribbean, as well as supporting countries from the Caribbean community with their ambitions on decarbonizing their end-use sectors? Dr. Gardner, the floor is yours. Devin, are you there? I think you have to unmute. There you go.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Seeley. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. Some is even good night. Within the context of the discussion that we're having here today, the CARICOM agenda is pursuing the issue of NDCs and mitigation through a slightly different lens than what maybe our colleague Ezra from Antigua may have pointed it out as in that regard. We are going to look at the issue of the energy approach through one of energy security and resilience as the primary drivers. That is how we have been approaching it. We're working with member states, looking at energy security and resilience as the primary drivers, with the understanding that mitigation benefits are a co-benefit or a co-product of the resilience and security pursuit. So we expect that in assessing the requirements for energy security and resilience both in a bi-directional sense. Resilience in the case of energy, the energy sector being made more resilient, not just to climate-based impacts, but we see also from the pandemic and so on, that resilience is also required on the demand side, that the sector itself, we're getting sector resilience for energy. And by making the energy sector more resilient, we think that the designs can also lead to societal resilience if we are able to build it in such a way that there is greater flexibility in the sectors with which energy are most correlated or most strongly coupled. So it's that nexus that we are trying to mesh and maximize how it is that we look at not just infrastructure resilience and the security of the infrastructure, but also the operational aspects. So we are doing a lot of work on what we call integrated resource and resilience planning, recognizing that a lot of the renewable energy options that we are talking about bringing into the system for mitigation purposes, in instances are impacted negatively, sometimes even more negatively than the conventional systems, by climate-related issues. Climate-related issues such as extreme weather, climate-related issues such as temperature increases. If you think about something like solar PV, the vast expanse of land over which a solar PV system sits makes it much more vulnerable to extremities of weather, such as high winds and storms and hurricanes and flooding, as compared to a very modular compact diesel plant, as an example. So we have to be making sure that when we transition from the dependence on fossil fuel supplies to the renewable energy systems, that intrinsic within that context is that there is a resilience of the system to climate-related impacts, both the extreme weather events, as well as the slower and more deliberate issues like the temperature increases, where, for instance, we know that small changes in temperature can affect the efficiency of solar photovoltaic generation, as an example. So we have to make sure there's a systematic match between the projections of temperature increase and the production that is expected over long or medium time scales of the power plant, and how that matches the demand, so that the balance, the optimal balance between supply and demand can be achieved. Recognizing too that demand will also be impacted by temperature changes, as an example. You have air conditioning loads, air conditioning efficiency, refrigeration loads, refrigeration efficiency, which will change with temperature increases. And so we are using what we call systematic scenario analysis. We are running models now together, working with the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and working in 5 member states so far. At this point, we are working with Belize, with Guyana, with Jamaica, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago to build out what we call integrated resource and resilience plans. Within that integrated resource and resilience planning framework that we are designing, it's really intended to ensure that we look at all the resource supplier options, look at them through the lens of what will allow us to do what Antigua said they want to do. You know, move away from dependence on overseas-based fuel sources and options, and to bring in indigenous clean energy options that give us greater flexibility and greater ability to adapt to the various shifts and changes and shocks that we will face, regardless of you know, whether we are shifting to new systems or not. And of course, to ensure that in doing so, that our systems are capable physically to stand up to various changes, and that operationally we have the kinds of mechanisms built in, the kinds of flexibilities built into the system, both in terms of how the system is configured, where the technologies are located, how the systems are operated, what kind of predictive intelligence and capabilities do system operators have, how system operators are trained to deal with the kind of variabilities that we will face and the kind of shock disruptions that we will face, and how is it that we can have different types of redundancies that can shift how we produce, deliver, and use energy, not just electricity, but energy as a whole, from one time to the next. The last point I want to raise too is that what we should not underestimate and ignore is the fact that there's a lot of fossil fuel development, well, let me not say fossil fuel, fossil resource development going on in the region. And the view is that, you know, while it is that we are moving towards a decarbonized energy sector, that we should also see the fossil sector not necessarily as just an energy supply option, but rather we can take the lessons and, from some of the countries in the world, like Trinidad and Tobago to a lesser extent, and in other instances, places like Denmark, where there is a focus on the downstream aspects of the fossil sector, where it is that most of the fossil resources are not burnt to produce carbon dioxide, but where the fossil resources are used in the petrochemical industry, where it is used, it is transformed in a chemical process that does not release greenhouse gas emissions, that produce high value materials and other types of products that we need as a society. So fossil resources are not bad. It is really that the fossil resources are bad when you use them in the energy sector and burn them to produce carbon dioxide. It's really that we need to focus a lot more on the downstream aspects of the fossil sector, where we can focus on not energy production, but rather on the production of on different types of products, such as things like tires and other petroleum derivatives, which are materials that are necessary for us to conduct life as we know it.
Thank you very much for that, Devin. Again, you have raised a number of points that I hope that we have some time today, and time is very short for us. I could almost feel the organizers telling me to move on and not ask any questions, but my intellect stops me from doing that, and I have to ask questions. I note your point about those of us in the region that are actively exploring for fossil fuels. I know that Guyana has just made a tremendous find offshore, et cetera. And I note your comment about moving away from combusting those fossil fuels and using them as feedstocks for further value added down the chain. I can't help but comment that I made that statement in New York 25 years ago at the UN Commission on Sustainable Development, and I was laughed out of the room.
Maybe you remember before your time, you.
Perhaps things will change in the future. Dr. McKeha, you've waited patiently, so let's turn to the international side of things. As it was presented yesterday,
Yes.
IRENA is supporting countries worldwide with the NDC revision process. Can you please provide us with a brief overview of IRENA's work in the development of long-term energy scenarios, especially in the NDC's context? Asami, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Siri. So let me start by recognizing that long-term energy scenarios have been used as an important policy instrument in the energy planning process of the government. And in particular in Latin America and Caribbean, many governments use this tool for developing, for devising energy planning. And particularly some countries develop their own national long-term energy scenarios and use them to guide energy policy. And when countries have robust national energy scenarios, or maybe more importantly, to have a robust institutional setup to develop energy scenarios, then NDC can be derived from this process or can start from this process. And having energy scenario is one thing, but having institutional framework for developing energy scenarios and reflecting that into energy policy is another aspect. And many governments in Latin America have already a good institutional framework for developing national energy scenarios. And with this, I would like to mention IRENA's support on NDC, particularly in terms of the support of long-term energy planning and scenarios development. Our support, important part of our support is through supporting to enhance energy planning capacity in the government. So we have programs that directly targeted at supporting NDC revision process, which we perform in cooperation with UNDP and NDC partnership. For example, my team specifically is working with Ecuador government to develop a program that aims at enhancing the understanding of energy modeling tools for developing long-term energy scenarios, assumptions, and consultation process around the development of NDC through the series of training sessions. We also work with several other Latin American countries, and we jointly develop program that meets the needs of the countries and that reflects IRENA's expertise on energy planning support. And long-term, so direct support on NDC revision this time around is, of course, very important, but also we believe that in the long term, it's important to keep supporting countries to enhance the energy planning capacity. It's very critical. And we provide training on modeling tools. We also develop roadmap with country experts We also provide forums where countries exchange the energy planning practices and the use of energy models. And in this context, I would like to mention two types of forums that we are currently actively engaging. One is a forum that focuses on exchanging the experiences on the way to represent renewable energy in their long-term energy scenarios. So this forum is really to discuss quite techy thing about how to represent certain characteristics of renewable energy, particularly the variability, what types of modeling tools is used, how to define the time horizon, all these technical detail thing. And in parallel, we also organize a network of scenario practitioners on long-term energy scenarios. So we call it LTES, Long-Term Energy Scenarios Network. And already some countries in the Latin America are part of it. For example, Brazil and Chile and Mexico are the active members of this network. And we are still welcoming countries in Latin America and Caribbean to join the network. In this network, we exchange more institutional setup, how the countries are using scenarios, developing scenarios. And it's been very interesting to see so many different ways of government developing scenarios. Some countries use internal capacity, other countries collaborate more with a local academic institution, other countries rely more on the external partners. So it's been very interesting. And one of the things that we discussed there is how we can better align the process of development of national energy scenarios with the climate policy making. And in this context, I would also, maybe this is the last comment because we don't have a lot of time. We are organizing on the 17th of December, next week, Thursday. Yesterday, UNFCCC already mentioned, we co-organize with UNFCCC an event that talks about how we can go beyond political ambition of net zero. So there's many countries joining the group of countries that announce net zero, high level ambition for deep decarbonization. And we wanted to discuss now how we can actually go from the political ambition statement to devising the pathways. How can countries devise country level net zero scenarios and pathways? So this is going to be a quite high level event. We feature some of the good example countries such as Chile from the region and Spain and UK and European Commission. And I think it's going to be a very interesting event. And I would like to welcome everyone who are interested in this topic to join this webinar next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nakata, and I urge also my colleagues in the region to take advantage of the tools that and the fora that are being provided by IRENA. You mentioned the network in our region. I urge our CARICOM members to take advantage of that network. When I was in Grenada, I was very proud that Grenada was a founding member of IRENA and a founding member of the preparatory committee for IRENA, and now IRENA has grown into an organization that is truly providing practical support to the region. Colleagues, that was the first round of questions. We've probably exhausted all of our time, but I am, until the organizers come in and tell us that we have to keep quiet, I'm going to go for a second round, but I'm going to ask you to keep your answers as brief as possible. Ezra, Antigua, I'm going to come back to you. Antigua and Barbuda has been working in the development of decarbonization roadmaps for the power and the transport sectors. Could you please explain to us how these roadmaps are being implemented as part of the revised NDC and how these scenarios are contributing to your long-term strategy? We're trying to get that link between your roadmap, your NDC, and your long-term strategy. Ezra, your floor is yours.
Well, we're not at the point of full implementation of the phase out, but as I mentioned earlier, we did reach out to key agencies to get some assistance in determining what our roadmap may look like. So far, climate analytics, we did 2 independent studies. Climate analytics led one on the GHG reduction report. And that basically proposed 4 interlocking stages for the fossil fuel phase out. Phase 1 would be replacing aging power plants, modernizing the grid, increasing rooftop solar PV, as well as starting the transition in the transport sector, coupling the power sector and EVs through V2G, banning the importation of ICE vehicles by 2030. And the phase 3 would be phasing out of centralized fossil fuels by 2030, increasing our resources on the grid, exploring grid stabilizing technologies such as hydrogen and battery. And for phase 4, that would be ensuring that we have a fully functioning smart grid with sector coupling. Now, for the IRENA study, which is a fossil fuel phase out and energy resilience roadmap, the objectives of that related to identifying like a resilient least cost pathway for the development of Antigua and Barbuda's energy sector until 2030. Also exploring RE options for the transport sector, such as EVs by 2040. So this is what we initially proposed to them. They are still finalizing that particular study, but the emerging pathways so far looks at an 87.6% RE penetration on the grid, and over 60% redundancy or 30 megawatt RE backup systems with batteries via rooftop solar. And this would be placed on key government buildings, on homes, farms. Off-grid energy for water generation is a consideration, as well as bi-directional charging for EVs, for households and for businesses. The third pathway that we're seeing is that backup generators and LPG generators for the use in the hotel sector, which is a very big sector here for Antigua and Barbuda, and also backup generators for large energy uses. So that particular study was based on scenario analysis. And we do anticipate that from what they're proposing, there's an optimal scenario that like we're considering, that based on what was proposed, there would remain like a 91 megawatt of fossil fuels, and an 89 megawatt of installed wind energy and 199 megawatt of solar via PV. So while the fossil fuel capacity is still very substantial, fossil fuel generation, what we're seeing based on the early findings, is a minimal at 5%, and this would be from government and private sources. So IRENA did acknowledge that the existing fossil fuel plants would not be decommissioned before their time, but in this optimal scenario, they simply serve as support to the RE systems. So based on those 2 independent studies, we're seeing for our NDC.
To wrap up really quickly, we already got like 1 minute per person. Go ahead.
Yeah, so based on these studies, what we're seeing is that it will have impacts on sectors such as the backup energy, the grid-tied energy, transportation, agriculture, construction, infrastructure, and information technology. So emerging from that, we're seeing an 86 for our proposed NDC target, whereas we are proposing an 86% RE generation in electricity sector by 2030, and a 100 RE generation in the transportation sector by 2040. There are other targets that we're considering, such as a circular economy policy and regulations in place by 2025, and other targets specifically to boost backup energy renewable systems.
Sorry, I was just busy scribbling down the targets that you were setting for your NDC. I was taking on my role as the one who's advising the government of Barbados on its NDC targets. Ezra, I'd love to be able to come back and ask you about banning internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030 and the politics of that, especially as we small islands are entirely dependent upon what the manufacturers send to the region, and therefore what electric vehicle products and types would be out there. I'm sure Devin would like to come in on that as well. But let me turn quickly to Ms. Olivet and ask you almost the same question. Can you explain to us how Uruguay is including its long-term low emission development as part of its revised NDC? So how you link in your long-term strategy into your revised NDC?
Well, yes, it's important to say that our first NDC was presented in 2017, not in 2015. So we will submit the second NDC in 2022 with commitments to 2030. That's important to say because we are not so hurried. We are working on the long-term strategy now, a little delay by the pandemic, and we hope to complete it and submit it next year. But as we stated in our national policy of climate change, for us, the NDC is like, it will like we say the block change to the long-term strategy. Well, we say the same for our national climate change policy. So that's the way we see it. We understand that this strategy, this long-term, it's a long-term vision. We think it will facilitate us designing and implementing in short and medium-term actions, and that will define objectives for the NDCs. Therefore, this long-term strategy will include both mitigation and adaptation. In fact, we are in the construction and the elaboration of our energy national adaptation plan. Also, in the energy sector, this will be part of the strategy. And this NAP is a commitment that comes from the first NDC, okay? Well, as an example, because this is a lot of general things, as an example, we are working with the support of IRENA through the Climate Action Enhancement Package of the NDC partnership to increase the ambition of the new NDC. And it consists on the application of the Flex tool, that's a tool IRENA developed, in scenarios with different penetration and different characteristics of the technologies. And these scenarios have different EVs and hydrogen penetration or characteristics. So this type of charging, type of technology to electrolyze, etc. In addition, given the weight of hydropower in our power mix, we are analyzing, or we may say IRENA is modeling different conditions in dry, normal, or rainy years. And this allows us to have a more systemic information on the influence of different variables, and thus be able to make adjustment to advance towards the goal to which we aspire. Briefly, that.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for being so concise. Devin, I'm going to turn to you quickly. In the Caribbean context, what are the energy trends towards the decarbonization of the end-use sectors, transport industry, etc., and their relevance to the long-term strategies? And what are the challenges that many countries face in this pathway? Dr. Gardner.
Yes, sir. So in respect to the end use strategy that we are looking at, we have done quite a bit of work recently on what we call a regional energy efficiency strategy. Even though this strategy looked at the entire value chain from the generation side to the end use side, I'll focus on the end use side in this specific instance. The transport side obviously was one of those where it was identified that there's a significant amount of energy efficiency gains that are possible, and of course some amount of decarbonization in terms of switching of technology from internal combustion engine to electric, and eventually in the longer term to hydrogen, and that holds for not just land vehicles but also for some amount of maritime transport, especially river ferries that are used in Ghana and some of these countries, and short run ferries that are used in some of the maritime spaces in like water taxis in St. Kitts and Nevis, Trinidad and Tobago, etc. So there is the view that in the short term, you look at LNG or CNG as a possible early transition option, and that by the midterm 2025 thereabout, you should be looking at a complete move towards electric vehicles. There'll be some early electrification, of course, in the early stages, but by the midterm, we should look at complete switch over to LNG and the integration of hydrogen in the eventual later or longer term. And that's the view. The importance of hydrogen for us is that a lot of the renewable energy assets that are cost effective, like the geothermal and the hydros, which exist in some of the countries, are in countries where the demand is low for electricity. And so the hydrogen allows us the opportunity to port some of that electricity that's available to other countries where the demand is high, and for it to be also be coupled with other sectors such as transport. So that's an important piece of hydrogen that is relevant to us. On the other aspect outside of transport, on the building sector, we are doing a lot of work in buildings looking at distributed energy resources, which looks at everything from solar rooftop solar PV, to efficient cogeneration and trigeneration technologies on the distribution side, which works in hotels and some types of industries, to service water heating, especially for industrial scale customers, to efficient lighting, efficient cooling. Those are things that we are promoting and working on in a very significant way. We have established an energy efficiency building code at CARICOM level, which we are seeking to implement at country level, so that every single user in countries will have mechanisms to guide how they design buildings to make them more efficient in terms of energy use, and how the technologies, what technologies and how the technologies should be implemented to give us certain kinds of energy performance. We're looking at minimum energy performance standards for cooling, lighting, and refrigeration. Cooling meaning air conditioning, refrigeration, and lighting. We have already established those, and we are working with countries to implement them through the usual standards arrangement. And we have established energy labeling standards for appliances, and we are also working very assiduously to implement that region-wide. Those are regional standards which we are seeking to adapt at the country level in the countries. We are looking to work with the electric utilities to drive and accelerate work on the end use side, working behind the meter. In the past, utilities usually work from left to right, where they pretty much looked at the supply, built out the generation, built the transmission system with the, and brought the electricity to the end users. Now we are working on models that are seeking to have the utilities walk from right to left, where they start with the consumer, understand what energy services the consumer require, figure out what would be the best configuration through which the consumer could access or should access these services, and work with the consumer to provide them with the desired access through a flexible and adaptable pathway. So if the consumer says, I want rooftop PV, I want solar water heaters, I want some efficient lights, I want some air conditioning, the electric utility will become a facilitator for that and charge the consumer a bill just like it would for electricity that's produced on the grid. And the consumer can have the option and the luxury of being grid tied and benefit from the services of the grid, in as much as the utility also benefit from the service of the consumers and the grid too, because one of the things we want to explore to a large extent is that bi-directional interaction between the grid and, of course, the premises of the consumers, because being able to provide ancillary services to the electric utilities, whether through load shifting or whether it is through additional generation from distributed systems, or whether distributed storage, is including through electric vehicles. These are things that we are exploring and looking at within the context of the integrated resource and resilience plan distributed energy resources is one of the key pieces of the plan that we are going to explore. So we're not just exploring options and opportunities for utility scale products to be brought online, but really we are delving into the possibilities and the realities through which we can bring distributed energy resources to interact more integrally and more with the grid. Looking at a situation where we transition the grid over the next 10 years in the countries to becoming modern, smart applications. So, putting in the kind of ICT devices that allow two-way bidirectional communication supported by the relevant legislation and policies in the short term. And in the long term, to get it to become really very, very high-tech and robust in terms of its communication capabilities.
Thank you so much, Devin. I didn't need to cut across you, but you were speaking quite quickly as well. So I hope that our interpreters have been able to capture that for our Spanish colleagues, because there was a lot of richness in what you were saying, and in particular, getting the utility companies to change their perspective and go from right to left, go from the end user back towards the services that are provided. And also, you mentioned looking for synergies that can be created regionally in the energy sector. Makita, I'm going to turn to you last. You're going to have the last word from Irina. So what is the importance of long-term energy scenarios to enable the decarbonization of the end-use sectors and for development of long-term strategies? I mean, you've mentioned these before, so perhaps just briefly reiterate, what's the importance of these long-term energy scenarios?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Siri. Maybe I would like to mention 3 points, and based on this discussion that I just mentioned, that we have this network of energy practitioners, energy scenario practitioners, LTS network. So I would like to draw on the experience from these discussion. One point is the importance of aligning the timeline. So in the LTS community, long-term energy scenarios community, we learned that it's important that shorter-term planning or shorter-term strategy is drawn from the longer-term strategy. And when we look at the climate policy context, we started with the shorter-term context of NDC, and now we are going to go to the longer-term strategy, and it should be actually the other way around. And now I think it's really important to have the iteration process from the long-term strategy to the NDC, and NDC to the long-term energy strategies. I think yesterday there was someone also mentioned about the importance of this continued process of planning. So that's the first point. And the second point is the importance of the coordination. So in the LTS community, a lot of best practices are seen in terms of organizing very solo consultation. We have seen example from Chile, we have seen example from Brazil. They organize very solo consultation process. And when we talk about deep decarbonization that we need to put in long-term energy, long-term strategy, we need to even enhance this consultation process, because we are talking about transformative change that would touch to every citizens. And it's more and more important, even more important, to really have a proper consultation process and to make the process of developing strategy as inclusive as possible. And the last point is more about the contents of the LTS long-term strategy. So from the discussion in the LTS network, we have kind of seen the convergence of opinion on what's needed in the longer term strategy, which is first of all is important to reflect innovations, and then important to reflect sector coupling, given that the electrification of end use sector is going to be the key, and the use of renewable energy to provide the power. These are kind of the key trends that we see across different scenarios. And this is very important, but it's very data intensive, and the data collection system in Latin American and Caribbean countries are quite different, quite diverse. And if some countries are not very strong in data collection system, and it's very important to have proper energy sensors, for example, that would really help to have proper planning and proper strategy development process. So data is really important. And secondly, methodologically, if we talk about innovation, sector coupling, it's something that is quite complicated. And for that, we see a good example of cooperating with local research institutions emerging. For example, this month I have seen that the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Project have published a very nice report for Latin America, which was developed by different countries in cooperation with as a cooperation of academics, Ministry of Environment, and the civil society. And that was, I think, is a good example of devising long-term strategy. So these are the 3 points that I wanted to mention. One is the timeline, the other one is coordination and the consultation, and the third one is the data and maybe engaging local research institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sasami. I don't want to repeat what you just said. I note the importance of planning, and you can't plan if you don't have the data. And that is a shortcoming that we have in this region that we have to correct. I note you said as well that perhaps we can work alongside some of our academic institutions as well to build that capacity to manage those data. Colleagues, it has been a very, very rich discussion. I want to thank you all. There's so many different areas that I wanted to touch on in this limited time. For example, we have not touched on carbon pricing and carbon markets and the relationship with their NDC versus the long-term goal of being carbon neutral. That could be a topic of its own. I do notice as well that in the NDCs that have been submitted so far, at least from the CARICOM region, that there's an element of conditionality in the NDCs. We can do so much, but we can do more if there's finance and support available to us. And I would love to have gotten into that as well. Ezra, Beatrice, Asami, Devin, thank you so much for your thoughts. And Jose, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Seeley, and thank you to the panelists for that very interesting discussion. We will now shift to the second and final panel discussion on engaging the private sector in the financing of NDC's implementation during the post-COVID-19 recovery period. This panel will be moderated by Maria Tapia, climate change specialist of the Inter-American Development Bank. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maria Tapia. I have been already introduced, and I'm delighted to moderate this panel. And I have a couple of experts joining me into this panel. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip most of their curriculum, but I can assure you that they are all experts in their field. But joining me, it's also Neha Muki. She's a senior specialist in the energy and climate change at the World Bank. Federico Fischer, regional coordinator of Caribbean and Central of the Private Financing Advisory Network. Miranda Maurice George, a division of country programming at the GCF, and Ahmed Badar, acting director, project facilitation and support of IRENA. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this. And we are all here because we all understand and agree that there's inadequate access to finance, to financing remains at the constraint to achieve Paris Climate Agreement goals. Before COVID, the international community for climate action was working with governments developing climate finance strategies and financial roadmaps, integrating NDCs into national planning and budgets and revenue, project program facilities for resource mobilization and development bankable projects and pipelines. And last but not least, the private sector engagement. And while most of our Latin American governments are still spending their budgets in the health emergency, governments are now working at the same time in the planning for an economic recovery, but such economic recovery must be green, and it's key more than ever that we engage the private sector in helping create those green jobs to overcome this economic slowdown and push again the economic to the top, but in a more sustainable way. I had two questions for my panelists, but again, for the sake of time, I apologize. And I will try to merge the two questions I had for my panelists into one. And I will ask our panelists to maintain their answers as short as possible, as we have already exceed the time of the event. So I will start with Neha. Could you please provide us with a brief overview of the financing mechanisms and strategies that the World Bank has to support Latin American countries for their NDC implementation? Specifically, if you could put these into an example of the region, a concrete example.
Sure. Thank you so much, Maria, and it's a pleasure to be here among the panelists on a very important topic today. Let me start out by saying, so as part of the bank engagement strategy in the region and broadly globally, the bank, of course, recognizes, climate change as a threat to global development and its own mission of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. So in line with that, the bank has adopted climate change targets as part of our own financing and support to countries to so that a certain share at least of our financing is dedicated towards climate related outcomes. Now, as a very specific focus within that comes supporting countries on NDC implementation and financing that implementation as well. In terms of specific examples, our engagement ranges from policy support that creates enabling environments in countries to spur investments beyond just public sector, but to attract private sector financing. Then it's also looking at direct investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and broader power systems strengthening for resilience and for integrating renewables, either through direct investments in projects or through channeling financing through financial intermediaries in the region for further on lending to clients and private sector participants. Now, going from a more policy-based approach to investment focus, there's also, as you'd highlighted, in addition to the need for financing, there are several risks that reduce the access to finance for a lot of private sector. So in terms of addressing that issue of access to financing, the bank puts together a range of risk mitigation instruments, financial solutions that help address these market barriers to crowd in private sector investments. Examples for this would include our engagement, for example, in Argentina, where the guarantee instrument that was provided to scale up renewable energy investments was able to mobilize about $4.5 billion of investment in 2 rounds of auctions for renewable energy investments. Similarly, in Colombia, we have a guarantee instrument in place, which is helping to scale up investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency. Now, shifting from these risk mitigation instruments, looking at how to scale up these availability of finance, because of course, as we know, public finance is scarce, and attracting private sector finance, bringing in that finance is also challenging. So, and the scale and pace of action that is needed to get on this transition is huge. So looking at alternative sources of finance, tapping into capital markets to make that financing flow into clean energy and energy transformation, or broadly NDC implementation investments is critical. So with that, we're working with counterparts, not just in Ministry of Energy, but also working with Ministries of Environment, Ministries of Finance, and central banks to see how these alternative sources of financing in the region could be tapped into to make that financing available for NDC implementation. An example of this would include our recent work with the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, where we are working to put together a clean energy and infrastructure facility that helps attract financing through alternative sources and also reducing risks for private sector participation. So in a nutshell, we're talking about, covering the entire range of availability to address the availability of finance and the access to finance through de-risking and creating that policy environment to support countries. There are several examples of specific direct investments in power sector that support countries in NDC implementation, including geothermal investments or transmission and distribution loss reduction investments that are aligned to it. But the main vision here is to move beyond just a project by project approach, but to create a systems approach, a market environment that attracts and crowds in private sector finance. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to you, Maria.
Thank you. Federico, it's your turn to help us or showcasing what is your institution doing to support the NDC in the region. If you could help us, Federico, to go into more detail in the role of the private sector with the recovery of COVID in the renewable energy sector, but how your institution is supporting, and give us some examples on how to support this green recovery with the participation of the private sector in the renewable energy sector.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, UNFCCC and Irina, for the invitation. For us, the private financial advisory network has been around since 2006, supporting renewable energy and energy efficiency, and now expanded in the last few years to climate change, which may include resiliency, adaptation, and mitigation projects with no energy components. And we are part of the KSEP initiative. We have supported we support the financial closing globally for about 150 projects that are bringing a reduction of 4 million tons of CO2 a year, and recently supported the closing of 3 projects in the region that have directly impact on the targets of NDCs, because they are linked to increasing the renewable energy component and reducing the impact of climate change. A brief history in the region for PFAN has a couple of investment forums through 2015, and we relaunched a sustainable presence in the region about 14 months ago. So we are back in a different approach, in a sustainable approach, and with the idea of networking and cooperation with institutions, developers, and investors, creating as a project preparation and investment support program, creating the proper scenarios from the private sector with business between private sectors, meaning private sector investment and private investors and private sector developers, and not only to overcome the current conditions, but create a sustainable environment for increasing investment on the private side and increasing participation of private sector renewable energy, especially in countries where this is lacking. An example of collaboration, we work with UNFCCC regional for the Caribbean, revising the CDM pipeline to see how we can help these projects to move forward and contributing to gas reductions, and supporting CCRE with our colleagues at Get Invest in the design in a regional project preparation facility. And so on your question about how is the private sector role on the recovery, the private sector is working. I would say I have experience both in Latin America and Africa. I would say that the impact in the energy sector in Latin America has a strong presence of the private sector. And not only from the private sector from the size of developers, but the private sector on the size of investors, networks of investors, platforms from investors. That is not typical to find in other regions in the world. You have platforms like Red Contour in Colombia or Alianza 2030, which are looking into integrating different stakeholders, raising funds for projects. You have similar initiatives in SICA in Central America, as I mentioned before. CCRE is having an impact in the CARICOM region, trying to facilitate this initiative with a number of partners beyond PFAN and Get Invest. There is an incubator accelerator in the region and other participants coming in. So I will say that it's not necessarily an issue of not having the private sector supporting, is perhaps an issue of giving room to the private sector to participate more. And I will say that the region, some countries in the region need a sustainable enabling environment, which is lacking in some of the regions. And perhaps in some countries, perhaps one tend to see the region as a whole, and we try to see the region as it is by the countries they are in the region, because they are unique in many sense. And we think that there is a need to deploy adequate regulatory procedures and to design renewable energy sector the risk measurements, and looking to how we can adapt the enabling environment and the financial instruments to the uptake on the commercial and industrial space, e-mobility, distributed energy, and acceleration of energy efficiency programs. We need to show that change the perception that the investor-ready projects are those that qualify for standard lending programs. There are many different types of investors in the region that are looking into different kinds of returns and different kinds of models. So we are working into linking. We have an investors roundtable platform we're working with and the developers in order to be able to create this dialogue and align investors and developers that are addressing this, to have the same mandate. And finally, I would like to say that we should do more in focusing on project finance and on the solutions that brings this the energy, renewable energy and energy efficiency to the market. We tend to be concerned, especially in small island contexts, that there is no scalability. We tend to respond quickly that this or that issue is solved by PV or wind, but actually we need to look into integrated solutions where technology is just a component, is not the ultimate goal of the project. So technology is a tool to solve a problem. And with that, I close my answers to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. You did mention something that can help me open the next questions to Naranda from the Green Climate Fund, that it's the scalability. I know that for GCF, one of the key things they look when they review proposals is if a proposal that it's been submitted to the GCF mobilized private sector scales up has the scalability, makes transformational change. There are things that I'm pretty sure Naranda will help us understand when they look at programs or projects submitted by the different governments. What are they looking at? If they look, how they look into their NDCs. So I will ask you, Naranda, to give us a brief overview on how GCF is supporting the NDC enhancements in Latin American countries, and how can governments or private sector accredited entities can submit projects to the NDCs, what they have to include in these proposals so you can consider them into your approvals.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pia, for this introduction, and thank you all, UNFCCC, IRENA, and UK Co-Presidency 26 for providing GCF with this opportunity to shed some light on how we support countries. Well, to start off, in terms of enhancing NDCs through our readiness program, countries can tap into the resources allocated to them under the 1 million window to put forward proposals and looking at how they could improve the NDCs, creating an enabling environment to support NDC and NDC implementation, drafting concept notes that will bring forward and support NDC action and targets. And so we've been doing that. And so, for example, last year we would have approved for Dominica a readiness proposal that is looking at its geothermal resource in the economic feasibility analysis of a geothermal based green industrial eco park, right? And mapping and conducting activities that would also lead to creating a business partnership and collaboration to advance the development of what we call the GIEP, which is the Geothermal Industrial Park, Eco Park. So GCF has been doing this work, but we do recognize, and the board has recognized, that not only are we placed and able to support through to COP26 and strengthening countries' capacity, the GCF would have put forward an additional 2 windows for support. One is a technical assistance support, and the other, we call it modalities of operation. So one for programmatic proposals that would be channeled through DGGI or UNDP to revise and align national, subnational, and sectoral policies and plans, and assessing NDC costs and benefits and investment opportunities and enhancement for implementation, and also the technical assistance component that would look at analysis, assessments, and development of ambitious pathways. And so these are, on the readiness standpoint, how GCF continues to try to be relevant to countries in that regard. And so when we look at of course, we know the whole process through which GCF engages with countries is through ensuring that the whole aspect of country ownership is strong. And so we help countries to develop what we call a country program. And in that process, one of the key things, one of the key national documents that must be looked at is your NDCs, your climate sector strategies, etc. And so when the country elaborates that, through one of the things you say that we look for is a country-driven approach, right? Making sure that our investment criteria, the country ownership, the needs of the recipients are being met, and it is driving towards the sustainable development potential. We also look for a strong climate case, what we refer to as a climate rationale, to make sure that the countries have the information here that will demonstrate the climate impact that the project proposes to address. And so in that regard, it's closely related to paradigm shifting potential. And also we look at additionality in terms of, in the absence of GCF resources, would this project be able to be feasible and go ahead? And of course, there is the notion of ensuring that there is compliance with our policies, our fiduciary standards, risk management, environmental and social safeguards, etc. And so, for example, we would have an example where we demonstrate renewable energy, but as we have heard from some of the panelists earlier today, the whole nexus of putting everything together would have been the Barbados project, where we water sustainability renewable nexus for Barbados, where you have renewable energy integrated into a water utility system to improve efficiencies, to generate and to power, and of course contributing to Barbados's NDC targets as well. So this is in a nutshell how the GCF tries to incorporate, ensuring that countries are meeting the standards, but at the same time providing opportunities both through our readiness portfolio and through our programming generally to ensure that countries can meet their targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to be asking Ahmed to be kind of give us the last part of our presentation to try to help us close the panel. I will ask you, Ahmed, if you can talk about the Climate Investment Platform Initiative and the status of implementation in Latin America, and some examples of IRENA's project facilitation work in the Latin American region.
Thank you, Maria, very much. I did very much enjoy the intervention of all colleagues from World Bank and GCF and from the BFAN. Actually, the new divisions that I'm representing is very new to the agency, and actually was created to work in the core of the CIP. The CIP actually is an initiative that was launched back in September 2019 among GCF, UNDP, SE for All, and IRENA. And with one target that's basically helping the countries, specifically from the developing world, to reach their national determined contribution targets as per Ndc mechanism and Paris Agreement arrangements. The CIP, in a nutshell, is working on decluttering the global climate finance and working along the same line of IFC 3.0 strategy, which basically working on supporting the robustness of the upstream banking documentation. So by that, if you not, let me give you this example, Maria, to tell you exactly what it is. If you look, for example, for a very important reference number that was launched by KfW, that for a project from project development till reaching the COD, it takes 7 to 9 years, including 2 years of financial closure. What we do in the CIP, and specifically in IRENA, that we are working in a very agile terms. So we help countries to reach common closure maximum within 6 to 12 months. That's basically based on the competitive advantage, not comparative. I'm talking about the competitive advantage of IRENA, which mainly looking for being the trusted partners of 162 countries. So we are working globally. We are working with more than a dozen of CIP registered partners, including World Bank, including GCF, including African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, which you are, and basically all CIP partners, financial partners, they are working with us into that. And basically, since we have commenced our services, we have now reached very good common, what we call it, quick wins for more than 750 megawatt across over 22 countries. The idea here is that we are not working for a project development concept starting from the beginning, but more importantly, that there are projects that basically, when it started to commence the project completion, you always get some kind of drawbacks. For example, some governments or project sponsor, basically, they have to withdraw their commitment with regard to sovereign guarantee or the like. So we have to come in very quickly and to intervene and to provide several solutions, like, for example, financial restructuring, providing concessional funding. And that's exactly the issues that private sector developers mainly are looking at it. Not only that, but also we are looking for working in partnership with some IFIs to reach, as I just mentioned, project banking upstream documentation. Like, for example, we had to work mainly with COBEDIS, the Spanish Development Agency, to work on about 5 or 6 projects in Africa. And currently we are working, to give an example quickly with my intervention, in Latin America, working in hand in hand with UNDP for making the relevant fundraising for project in Colombia. It's pay-as-you-go project, because actually we don't work along only larger scale project, but work on all spectrum of scale, meaning small scale, larger scale, micro scale, smallest, whatever you call it. But our aim at the end to support the population of our membership, which around 162 countries, almost the globe, to provide the funding, access to funding, upstream business support till reaching financial closure. Because we notice that this is exactly the many challenge that most of the countries are in need for. We all know that bankable projects since the beginning have its own way in order to attract funding, or what basically Federico mentioned about investor-ready project. But nearly investor project or a challenging project is the one that needed help. And that's why the CIP have been created to do that and to support what we call it last mile of financial closure, and also to work on the banking upstream business support documentation. Finally, I have to tell you also, we are adding to this another integrated services by creating a new financing facility capitalizing on the phase 1 that IRENA had partnered with EDFD or Abu Dhabi Fund for Development. But this time we are going to partner with other IFIs, and we are going to launch that very soon in the coming General Assembly, January 2021. That's basically the CIP. And if I would like to summarize it before I close, the CIP working along 4 tracks. The first one is helping the countries to come up with very bankable NDCs, very ambitious one. Second one is to work on enhancing the regulations, whatever is needed in order to make sure that this project developed under the NDCs as ambitious plans to be implemented. The third one is working on the project development and basically project de-risking. And here we are not talking about de-risking of a normal, of a theory of the de-risking. No, we are working on transactional project-based de-risking. And finally, we are working on the matchmaking of the project based on physical matchmaking. And there are several other examples that we are working on. We do that with African Development Bank, and very soon we partner with the Inter-American Development Bank and other banks to do such a kind of physical matchmaking. And for the latter part, actually, we divided the world in terms of geographical coverage, similar but more detailed than the one of World Bank, that we covered the world by 14 sub-regional. For example, in Latin America, we cover 3 regions: North, Middle, and South Inter-American countries by geographical coverage. And also for Africa, we have 5 regions: South, West, North, and East, and Central. So by that, we are covering the whole world. We also have other regions for East and for Atlantic and for Caribbean small island developing states. We also have other 3 regions in Central Asia, another 2 for South and East Asia, and another 2 for Central and South Europe. So this is basically actually the CIP and how does it work to fit. And if I can summarize that in one sentence, I would say that the CIP within IRENA working along project transactional based approach on the business upstream without touching into fiduciary responsibility, as IRENA is not an implementing partner. Thank you very much. I hope I added something to the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you very much. Incredible to hear about the time frame of financial closing that the platform can offer. This is exactly what investors need. They need to. They are looking always for projects, but they don't like to have these long-term processes. Fantastic to have instruments and financing funds from the World Bank and the GCF to blend private sector capital, and to have networks like Federico's network that he represents, to connect the developers with the private sector investors. Thank you all, and I'm sorry for not being able to have more time to go into a deeper discussion. And I will leave the floor to Jose again, but thank you all for participating.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Maria, thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists for this very interesting discussion. We have now reached the end of this virtual event. During these 2 days, we have been provided access to the insights from government's representatives, not only on the challenges encountered during the enhancement phase of their first submitted NDCs, but also about the upcoming obstacles and tests that are envisioned in their countries and by institutions like UNDP and NDCP as a tougher road lays ahead. As pointed out yesterday, climate change is a matter that concerns everyone and is to be taken seriously for appropriate measures to be undertaken and make a difference moving forward. We also learned today about the importance of long-term energy scenarios in the development of NDCs, as well as the different technical support activities that organizations are providing for the NDC revision. Lastly, we heard from multinational organizations, development banks, and financing institutions on the financing options for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean in order to facilitate the implementation of their short-term energy plans along the revised NDCs. I want to thank the presenters and panelists, as well as all those attending the event. We appreciate your presence and invite you to join us during future events. Thank you and good afternoon.